The transformation of the ancient Mediterranean world in the 3rd century before the Common Era created the stage for one of history's most decisive military encounters. As the warm summer evening settles over the rolling hills of southeastern Italy, we begin our journey into the events that would forever change the course of Western civilization. The Battle of Cannae, fought on August 2, 216 BCE, stands as perhaps the most tactically brilliant victory in military history, a masterpiece of strategic thinking that would be studied in military academies for over 2 millennia. To understand the magnitude of what occurred on that fateful day near the small town of Cannae, we must first immerse ourselves in the world of the late 3rd century BCE, when 2 great powers dominated the Western Mediterranean like titans walking among mortals. Rome, the rising republic that had already begun to flex its military muscles across the Italian peninsula, stood poised to challenge the ancient maritime empire of Carthage, whose purple-sailed ships had ruled the seas for centuries. The roots of this conflict stretch back generations to the very foundations of Roman expansion beyond the Italian mainland. Sicily, that triangular jewel set in the azure waters between Italy and Africa, had become the first prize in what historians would later call the Punic Wars. The First Punic War, lasting from 264 to 241 BCE, had been primarily a naval conflict, with Rome surprising the world by building a fleet to challenge Carthaginian supremacy at sea. The war had ended with Roman victory and the loss of Sicily to Carthage, but the peace that followed was merely an intermission in a much larger drama. In the palaces of Carthage, located on the fertile coast of what is now Tunisia, the sting of defeat had never fully healed. The city that had once controlled trade routes spanning from the Atlantic coasts of Spain to the bustling markets of Egypt now found itself constrained, forced to pay heavy indemnities to Rome and forbidden from expanding its influence in traditional spheres. The Carthaginian nobility, descendants of Phoenician traders who had built their empire on commercial acumen and naval power, watched with growing concern as Roman influence spread across the Mediterranean like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. It was into this world of simmering tensions and unresolved conflicts that Hannibal Barca was born around 247 BCE. His father, Hamilcar Barca, had been one of Carthage's most capable generals during the First Punic War, earning the nickname Lightning for his swift and decisive campaigns. The Barca family represented the military aristocracy of Carthage, families who had served the city for generations and who viewed Rome not merely as a political rival, but as an existential threat to everything they held dear. The young Hannibal's childhood was shaped by stories of Carthaginian glory and Roman treachery. According to the ancient historian Livy, when Hannibal was still a boy of perhaps 9 years old, his father made him swear an oath of eternal enmity against Rome. This oath, sworn before the altars of Carthaginian gods, would become the driving force of Hannibal's life, a sacred commitment that would lead him across continents and through countless battles in pursuit of his sworn enemy's destruction. After the First Punic War, Hamilcar Barca had turned his attention to Spain, that vast peninsula rich in silver mines and populated by warlike Celtic and Iberian tribes. The conquest of Spain became not merely a military campaign but a carefully planned program of imperial expansion designed to provide Carthage with the resources and manpower necessary to challenge Rome once again. The systematic subjugation of Spanish tribes, conducted with a combination of military force and diplomatic cunning, created a new Carthaginian empire that stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the Atlantic shores. Hannibal came of age in the Spanish crucible, learning the arts of war and diplomacy while commanding increasingly important military operations. By the age of 26, he had been elected by the Carthaginian army as their supreme commander in Spain, a position that gave him virtually unlimited authority over military operations and diplomatic relations with local tribes. His rise to power had been meteoric, but it was built on solid foundations of military competence and political acumen that impressed even his enemies. The Spanish campaigns had provided Hannibal with something that would prove invaluable in his later campaigns against Rome: a truly international army composed of diverse peoples united by loyalty to their commander rather than to any particular nation or city. Celtic warriors from the northern mountains brought their fierce courage and excellent metalworking skills. Iberian tribesmen contributed their expertise in guerrilla warfare and their intimate knowledge of difficult terrain. Numidian cavalrymen from North Africa provided mobile striking power that could match and often exceed the capabilities of any mounted force in the ancient world. This multinational army was bound together by more than mere military discipline. Hannibal possessed a rare gift for inspiring loyalty across cultural and linguistic boundaries, speaking multiple languages fluently and adapting his leadership style to the customs and expectations of different peoples. His soldiers, drawn from dozens of different tribes and nations, came to view him not merely as a commander, but as a father figure who would lead them to glory and riches beyond their wildest dreams. The Roman Republic during this period was experiencing its own transformation, evolving from a city-state that controlled the Italian peninsula into a Mediterranean power with imperial ambitions. The Roman military system, based on citizen soldiers organized into legions and supported by allied troops from conquered Italian cities, had proven remarkably effective in the campaigns that had brought all of Italy under Roman control. The Roman formula for conquest combined military efficiency with political flexibility, offering conquered peoples the opportunity to join the Roman system as allies or even eventual citizens. Roman society in the early 2nd century BCE was still fundamentally agricultural, with most citizens owning small farms that provided both their livelihood and their qualification for military service. The Roman army was essentially a militia of property-owning farmers who served during campaign seasons and returned to their fields when military operations concluded. This system had worked well for local Italian warfare, but it was about to be tested against an enemy who thought on a completely different scale. The Roman political system, with its complex balance of elected magistrates, advisory senate, and popular assemblies, was designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating too much power. The highest executive positions, the consulships, were held by 2 men simultaneously and limited to single-year terms. This system of checks and balances had prevented the kind of military dictatorship that had plagued other ancient republics, but it also made long-term strategic planning difficult and sometimes led to conflicting military commands. The immediate cause of the Second Punic War lay in the Spanish city of Saguntum, a Roman ally located within the Carthaginian sphere of influence. The city's strategic location and its alliance with Rome created a diplomatic crisis that neither side could resolve peacefully. Hannibal's siege and eventual capture of Saguntum in 219 BCE provided Rome with the pretext for war, but the underlying causes ran much deeper than this single incident. Both powers understood that the Mediterranean was not large enough for 2 great empires. The question was not whether war would come, but when and how it would be fought. Roman strategy initially focused on carrying the war to Carthaginian territories in Spain and Africa, utilizing their superior naval forces to strike at Carthaginian commerce and colonial possessions. The Romans expected a replay of the First Punic War, with naval battles and overseas campaigns determining the outcome. Hannibal, however, had conceived a completely different strategic approach. Rather than waiting for Roman attacks on Carthaginian territories, he would strike at the heart of Roman power by invading Italy itself. This audacious plan required not only extraordinary military skill but also perfect timing and flawless execution. The logistical challenges alone were staggering. Moving a large army with its supplies and equipment across the Pyrenees, through hostile Gallic territories, and over the Alps into northern Italy during the onset of winter. The political situation in Rome as war approached was characterized by the kind of confident optimism that often precedes great disasters. The Roman Senate, composed of former magistrates and elder statesmen, had grown accustomed to military success and could hardly conceive of a foreign enemy successfully invading Italian soil. The memory of Pyrrhus of Epirus, who had invaded Italy in the 280s BCE, provided some precedent for foreign invasion, but Pyrrhus had ultimately been defeated and expelled, reinforcing Roman confidence in their defensive capabilities. Roman military preparations for the Second Punic War reflected this confidence. The consuls for 218 BCE, Publius Cornelius Scipio and Tiberius Sempronius Longus, were assigned armies intended for offensive operations. Scipio was to attack Carthaginian forces in Spain, while Longus would lead an expedition to Africa itself. The concept of defending Italy against invasion was so foreign to Roman thinking that no significant defensive preparations were made for the Italian peninsula. The Roman army of this period was organized around the manipular system, a tactical formation that had evolved from earlier phalanx-based organizations to provide greater flexibility on the battlefield. Roman legions consisted of about 4,200 infantry organized into 120 maniples, small units of 60 to 120 men that could maneuver independently while maintaining overall formation integrity. Each legion was supported by approximately 300 cavalry and an equal number of allied troops from other Italian cities. Roman military training emphasized discipline, endurance, and collective action rather than individual heroics. Roman soldiers were taught to fight as part of a unit, using standardized weapons and tactics that had been refined through generations of Italian warfare. The Roman short sword, or gladius, was designed for close combat, while the large rectangular shield, or scutum, provided protection and could be used offensively in coordinated shield wall attacks. The Roman military system's greatest strength lay in its ability to replace losses and maintain consistent quality across multiple armies. The Roman Confederation controlled a population of several million people, providing a vast reservoir of manpower that could sustain prolonged military campaigns. Roman allies throughout Italy were required to provide troops for military operations, creating a military system that grew stronger as Roman territory expanded. As the summer of 218 BCE approached, neither side fully understood the magnitude of the conflict they were about to begin. The Romans expected another overseas war like the First Punic War, with naval operations and distant campaigns determining the outcome. The Carthaginians, led by Hannibal's brilliant strategic vision, prepared for a war of unprecedented scope and intensity that would test the very foundations of both civilizations. The stage was set for a conflict that would reshape the ancient world. In the mountains of Spain, Hannibal was putting the finishing touches on his preparations for the most audacious military campaign in ancient history. In Rome, the Senate was debating strategy for what they expected would be another victorious foreign war. Neither side could imagine that within 2 years, a Carthaginian army would be camped within sight of Rome's walls, or that the outcome of their conflict would determine which civilization would dominate the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. The warm Mediterranean evening settles over the ancient world as we prepare to follow Hannibal's incredible journey from Spain to Italy, a march that would test human endurance and military genius to their absolute limits. The die had been cast, and the ancient world would never be the same. Chapter 2: The Journey Through the Alps. The spring of 218 BCE brought with it an unusual bustle of activity in the Carthaginian territories of southeastern Spain. In the city of New Carthage, known today as Cartagena, Hannibal's preparations for his audacious campaign had reached their final stages. The harbor, normally filled with merchant vessels carrying silver and other Spanish products to markets across the Mediterranean, now teemed with warships and transport vessels being prepared for what would become one of history's most remarkable military expeditions. Hannibal's army, as it assembled in the hills around New Carthage, represented a microcosm of the ancient world's diversity. The core of his force consisted of approximately 12,000 African infantry, veterans of campaigns in North Africa who had proven their worth in the harsh deserts and mountains of their homeland. These men, armed with long spears and large shields, formed the backbone of Carthaginian military power. Their bronze armor gleamed in the Spanish sun, and their disciplined formations reflected years of professional military service. Alongside the African troops marched 8,000 Iberian infantry, recruited from the tribes that Hamilcar Barca and his successors had conquered or allied with during their Spanish campaigns. These warriors brought with them the fierce independence of mountain peoples and an intimate knowledge of guerrilla warfare that would prove invaluable in the challenges ahead. Their weapons varied according to tribal customs. Some carried the distinctive falcata, a curved sword that could cleave through armor, while others preferred javelins and small round shields that allowed for greater mobility. The cavalry component of Hannibal's army was perhaps its most formidable element. Nearly 9,000 horsemen had been assembled from across the Carthaginian territories, but the elite among them were the Numidian light cavalry. These North African warriors, riding without saddles on their swift horses, possessed an almost supernatural ability to maneuver on the battlefield. Their tactics involved swift charges, rapid retreats, and the deadly accurate use of javelins thrown while riding at full gallop. The Numidians had been honed by generations of warfare in the harsh landscapes of North Africa, where only the most skilled riders survived. But perhaps the most spectacular and psychologically intimidating component of Hannibal's force was his elephant corps. 37 of these massive animals, each weighing several tons and standing nearly 10 feet tall, had been trained for warfare in the Carthaginian territories of North Africa. These were not the massive African elephants that roam the savannas today, but rather the smaller North African subspecies that had been hunted to extinction by Roman times. Each elephant was equipped with a wooden howdah, a fortified platform that could carry several warriors, and their tusks had been fitted with metal points to increase their effectiveness in battle. The logistics of moving such a diverse and numerous army across hostile territory represented a challenge that would have daunted lesser commanders. Hannibal's staff had spent months calculating the supplies needed for the journey, organizing pack animals, and establishing communication systems that could function across the linguistic barriers that separated the different components of his army. Each ethnic group within the force maintained its own command structure and cultural practices, but all were united by their loyalty to Hannibal and their shared desire for the riches that victory over Rome would bring. As the army prepared to depart from New Carthage in late spring 218 BCE, Hannibal took care to ensure that his strategic objectives were clearly understood by his subordinate commanders. The invasion of Italy was not merely a military campaign but a calculated political strategy designed to destroy the Roman Confederation by encouraging Rome's Italian allies to defect to the Carthaginian side. Success would require not just military victories but also the kind of political sophistication that could convince Italian cities to abandon their Roman allegiances. The first phase of the journey took Hannibal's army along the Mediterranean coast through territories that were largely under Carthaginian control. The march from New Carthage to the Pyrenees Mountains, a distance of several hundred miles, served as a shakedown cruise for the massive logistical operation that would sustain the army throughout its journey. The coastal route provided access to supplies and reinforcements, while the relatively easy terrain allowed the various components of the army to become accustomed to marching together. The weather during this initial phase of the campaign was generally favorable, with the warm Mediterranean climate providing comfortable conditions for the diverse troops under Hannibal's command. The army moved in a carefully organized formation, with scouts ranging far ahead to identify potential threats and suitable camping locations. The elephants, requiring special attention due to their size and dietary needs, were given their own supply train and handlers who had spent years learning to care for these magnificent but temperamental animals. As the army approached the Pyrenees, the landscape began to change dramatically. The rolling hills and fertile valleys of coastal Spain gave way to rugged mountain terrain that would test both the endurance of the troops and the organizational skills of their commanders. The Pyrenees, stretching for nearly 300 miles from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, represented the first major geographical barrier that Hannibal would need to overcome in his march to Italy. The mountain passes of the Pyrenees were controlled by various Celtic and Iberian tribes who had never submitted to Carthaginian authority. These mountain peoples, fiercely independent and skilled in guerrilla warfare, viewed the approach of Hannibal's army with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Some tribes saw the Carthaginian expedition as an opportunity to acquire wealth through trade or alliance, while others prepared to defend their territories against what they perceived as an invasion. Hannibal's approach to these mountain tribes demonstrated the diplomatic skills that complemented his military genius. Rather than attempting to force his way through the passes, he sent envoys ahead to negotiate safe passage and, where possible, to recruit additional warriors for his army. His reputation as a generous commander who shared the spoils of victory with his soldiers had spread throughout the region, and many young warriors were eager to join what promised to be a profitable expedition. The passage through the Pyrenees required nearly 2 weeks of careful maneuvering through narrow mountain passes and across swift-flowing rivers. The elephants proved particularly challenging to transport through the rocky terrain, requiring the construction of special ramps and platforms to enable them to navigate the steepest sections of the route. The engineering skills of Hannibal's officers were tested to their limits as they devised solutions to problems that had never been encountered in previous military campaigns. The weather in the mountains was unpredictable, with sudden storms and temperature changes that caught the army unprepared. The troops from North Africa, accustomed to desert conditions, found the cold mountain air particularly challenging, while the Spanish soldiers, more familiar with highland conditions, helped their comrades adapt to the new environment. The diversity of the army, initially seen as a potential weakness, began to emerge as a strength as different groups contributed their specialized knowledge and skills. As the army descended from the Pyrenees into the territory of modern-day France, they entered the lands of the Gallic tribes. Gaul in the 3rd century BCE was a patchwork of tribal territories, each with its own customs, leadership, and military traditions. The Gauls were renowned throughout the ancient world for their fierce warrior culture, their skilled metalworking, and their complex social hierarchies. Some Gallic tribes had already established trading relationships with Carthage, while others remained hostile to any foreign presence in their territories. The political situation in Gaul worked to Hannibal's advantage. Many of the Gallic tribes harbored resentment against Rome, which had been expanding its influence in southern Gaul for several decades. The Roman colony of Massalia, modern-day Marseilles, served as a center of Roman influence in the region, and Roman merchants and diplomats had been working to establish alliances with pro-Roman Gallic leaders. Hannibal's arrival provided an opportunity for anti-Roman factions within the Gallic tribes to assert themselves. The march through Gaul required constant diplomacy and occasional fighting, as Hannibal's army encountered tribes with varying attitudes toward the Carthaginian expedition. Some tribes, particularly those with grievances against Rome, welcomed the Carthaginians as potential allies and provided supplies, guides, and additional warriors. Others, whether out of loyalty to Rome or simple desire to protect their territories, opposed the army's passage and had to be defeated in battle or bypassed through alternative routes. The Gallic warriors who joined Hannibal's army brought with them a fighting spirit and tactical knowledge that would prove invaluable in the campaigns ahead. These men, tall and fair-haired compared to the Mediterranean peoples who formed the core of the Carthaginian force, were skilled in individual combat and possessed an intimate knowledge of the terrain they would traverse. Their long swords and distinctive shields added another dimension to the army's tactical capabilities. The crossing of the Rhone River, one of the major geographical obstacles in Gaul, demonstrated both the engineering capabilities of Hannibal's army and the continued challenges posed by hostile tribes. The river, swollen by spring rains and flowing swiftly toward the Mediterranean, could not be forded by the army's heavy equipment and elephants. The construction of rafts and temporary bridges required several days of intensive work, during which the army was vulnerable to attack from Gallic tribes that opposed their passage. The crossing of the elephants proved particularly dramatic and dangerous. These massive animals, terrified by the rushing water and unfamiliar with riverine crossings, required special handling and equipment. Large rafts were constructed and covered with earth to create the illusion of solid ground, but several elephants panicked during the crossing and fell into the river. The sight of these enormous creatures struggling in the swift current created panic among both the Carthaginian troops and the Gallic observers, demonstrating the psychological impact that the elephants would have on future battlefields. As the army moved north from the Rhone, they entered the territory of the Allobroges, a powerful Gallic tribe that controlled the approaches to the Alps. The Allobroges were skilled mountain warriors who knew every pass and pathway in their territory, and they viewed the approach of Hannibal's army with considerable suspicion. Initial negotiations with the tribal leadership proved difficult, as the Allobroges were concerned about the potential consequences of allowing such a large foreign army to pass through their lands. The arrival of autumn brought new challenges as the army prepared to attempt the most difficult phase of their journey, the crossing of the Alps. The mountain range that separated Gaul from Italy was one of the most formidable geographical barriers in the ancient world, with peaks reaching heights of over 15,000 feet and passes that became impassable during winter months. The timing of the crossing would be crucial, as the army needed to complete the passage before heavy snows made the higher elevations inaccessible. Hannibal's choice of route through the Alps remains one of the most debated questions in ancient military history. Modern scholars have proposed various theories about which specific pass he used, with the most likely candidates being the Col du Clapier or the Col du Mont Cenis. The ancient sources provide tantalizing clues but lack the geographical precision needed to determine the exact route with certainty. What is clear is that Hannibal chose a path that balanced the competing demands of speed, security, and accessibility for his diverse army. The ascent into the Alps began in early autumn, with the army leaving the fertile valleys of Gaul for the harsh mountain environment that would test their endurance to the breaking point. The narrow mountain paths, barely wide enough for the passage of pack animals, forced the army to march in single file for much of the journey. The elephants, already stressed by the long march and unfamiliar terrain, began to show signs of the exhaustion that would claim many of their number before the crossing was complete. The weather in the Alps was unpredictable and often severe, with sudden storms bringing rain, snow, and dangerous winds that could trap the army in exposed positions. The temperature dropped dramatically as the army climbed higher, and troops from North Africa and Spain, unaccustomed to cold weather, began to suffer from exposure and altitude sickness. The thin mountain air made breathing difficult, and the reduced oxygen levels affected both men and animals, slowing the army's progress and increasing the risk of accidents. The hostile mountain tribes that controlled the Alpine passes posed a constant threat to the army's progress. These Celtic peoples, skilled in mountain warfare and intimately familiar with the terrain, conducted hit-and-run attacks against the column, targeting supply trains and isolated detachments. The narrow paths made it impossible for the army to deploy in battle formation, forcing Hannibal to rely on small groups of elite troops to secure the route ahead of the main force. The psychological impact of the Alpine crossing on the army was perhaps as significant as the physical challenges. The troops, many of whom had never seen snow or experienced temperatures below freezing, began to question the wisdom of their expedition. The sight of comrades collapsing from exhaustion or exposure, combined with the constant threat of attack from mountain tribes, created a morale crisis that threatened to destroy the army's cohesion. Hannibal's leadership during this crisis demonstrated the qualities that had made him one of history's greatest military commanders. He shared the hardships of his men, marching on foot rather than riding and taking personal risks to maintain the army's morale. His presence at the most dangerous points of the march, combined with his calm confidence in the face of seemingly impossible challenges, inspired his diverse troops to continue their struggle against the mountain's hostility. The descent from the Alps into Italy proved even more treacherous than the ascent. The steep downward slopes were made slippery by early snow and ice, causing men and animals to lose their footing and fall to their deaths. The elephants, already weakened by the cold and altitude, found the descent particularly difficult, and several of the magnificent animals were lost during this phase of the journey. The sight of these massive creatures struggling and dying in the mountain passes created a profound sense of loss among the troops who had traveled so far together. After 15 days in the Alps, Hannibal's army finally emerged into the Valley of northern Italy. The cost of the crossing had been enormous. Of the nearly 90,000 men who had left Spain, only about 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry remained. Most of the elephants had perished during the mountain crossing, and those that survived were weakened and in poor condition. The army that descended into Italy was a mere fraction of the force that had begun the journey, but it was composed of hardened veterans who had survived one of the most difficult military expeditions in ancient history. The survivors of the Alpine crossing were bound together by shared hardship and a deep loyalty to their commander who had led them through seemingly impossible challenges. They had witnessed Hannibal's genius for improvisation and his unwavering determination to reach Italy, and they understood that they were part of a military expedition that would be remembered for centuries. The Great March was complete, but the real test of their strength and their commander's strategic vision was about to begin. Chapter 3: The Italian Campaign before Cannae. The Po Valley in late autumn 218 BCE stretched before Hannibal's exhausted army like a promised land after the trials of the Alpine crossing. The fertile plains of northern Italy, with their rich agricultural lands and prosperous cities, represented not just a geographical destination but the beginning of a new phase in the conflict between Carthage and Rome. The morning mist rose from the Po River as the survivors of the mountain crossing descended into a landscape that would become the stage for some of the most decisive battles in ancient history. Hannibal's immediate priority was the recovery and reinforcement of his army. The crossing of the Alps had reduced his force to approximately 26,000 men, but these survivors represented the hardened core of what would become one of history's most effective military organizations. The diversity that had characterized the army from its beginning now proved to be a crucial asset, as warriors from different cultures shared their knowledge and skills to overcome the challenges of operating in unfamiliar territory. The Celtic tribes of the Po Valley, known to the Romans as Cisalpine Gauls, had been engaged in periodic conflicts with Rome for several generations. These proud peoples, who had migrated into northern Italy centuries earlier, maintained their traditional warrior culture while adapting to the agricultural lifestyle of the fertile plains. The arrival of Hannibal's army represented an opportunity for the Gallic tribes to strike back against Roman expansion and reclaim territories that had been lost in previous conflicts. The political situation in northern Italy worked to Hannibal's advantage in ways that even his strategic genius could not have fully anticipated. The Roman conquest of the region had been relatively recent and incomplete, with many tribal leaders harboring resentment against Roman rule. The Roman colonies established in the area, such as Placentia and Cremona, served as centers of Roman influence, but also as symbols of foreign domination that the local populations viewed with suspicion and hostility. Hannibal's diplomatic approach to the Gallic tribes demonstrated the political sophistication that complemented his military brilliance. Rather than treating the Gauls as subjects to be conquered, he presented himself as a liberator who had come to free them from Roman oppression. This message resonated powerfully with tribal leaders who had watched Roman influence steadily expand throughout their traditional territories. The promise of shared spoils and the restoration of Gallic independence provided powerful incentives for cooperation. The reinforcement of Hannibal's army with Gallic warriors transformed both its composition and its capabilities. The Gauls brought with them not only additional manpower but also invaluable knowledge of local terrain, Roman military practices, and the political dynamics of the Italian peninsula. Their long swords, distinctive shields, and fierce fighting spirit added new tactical dimensions to an army that had already demonstrated remarkable adaptability during its long journey from Spain. The Roman response to Hannibal's arrival in Italy reflected the shock and confusion that his audacious strategy had created. The consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had been preparing for offensive operations in Spain, was forced to redirect his army to meet the unexpected threat in northern Italy. The Roman military system, designed for predictable seasonal campaigns, struggled to adapt to the strategic flexibility that Hannibal's presence demanded. The first major encounter between Roman and Carthaginian forces occurred along the Ticinus River in late November 218 BCE. This engagement, though relatively small in scale, established patterns that would characterize the early phase of the Italian campaign. The Roman army, organized in traditional manipular formations and supported by allied troops, found itself facing an enemy that combined diverse tactical approaches in ways that confounded conventional military wisdom. The Battle of the Ticinus was primarily a cavalry engagement, with Hannibal's Numidian horsemen and Celtic allies facing Roman and allied cavalry supported by light infantry. The Numidian tactics, involving swift charges followed by rapid withdrawals and the accurate use of javelins, proved devastatingly effective against Roman formations that had been trained for different types of combat. The psychological impact of the Numidian war cries and the sight of their seemingly wild charges created confusion in the Roman ranks that tactical discipline could not entirely overcome. Publius Cornelius Scipio was severely wounded during the engagement, an event that deprived the Roman forces of experienced leadership at a crucial moment. His son, the future Scipio Africanus, was said to have saved his father's life during the battle, but the elder Scipio's injury forced the Romans to retreat and reconsider their approach to the Carthaginian threat. The wound, though not fatal, symbolized the broader trauma that Hannibal's arrival had inflicted on Roman confidence and strategic planning. The Roman retreat from the Ticinus allowed Hannibal to consolidate his position in northern Italy and continue the process of recruiting Gallic allies. The psychological impact of the Roman defeat spread rapidly through the region, encouraging tribes that had been hesitant to commit to the Carthaginian cause. The sight of Roman forces in retreat, combined with evidence of Hannibal's military effectiveness, provided compelling arguments for those who advocated cooperation with the invaders. The winter of 218 to 217 BCE was spent in careful preparation for the campaigns that would follow. Hannibal established winter quarters in the Po Valley, using the time to train his reinforced army and integrate the new Gallic recruits with his veteran troops. The process of creating a unified fighting force from such diverse elements required exceptional leadership skills and an understanding of the cultural sensitivities that could either bind the army together or tear it apart. The Roman response to their defeat at the Ticinus involved a fundamental reassessment of their strategic position. The Senate, initially confident that the war would be fought in distant territories, now faced the reality of a formidable enemy army operating on Italian soil. The appointment of Tiberius Sempronius Longus as consul for 217 BCE, along with the reinforcement of Roman armies in northern Italy, represented an attempt to regain the initiative through conventional military means. The Battle of Trebia, fought in December 218 BCE during one of the coldest winters in recent memory, demonstrated Hannibal's ability to use environmental conditions as tactical weapons. The engagement began with a carefully planned provocation, as Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry across the frozen Trebia River to harass the Roman camp. The psychological effect of the dawn attack, combined with the physical discomfort of the cold weather, created exactly the kind of conditions that favored Hannibal's tactical approach. Sempronius Longus, eager to achieve a decisive victory that would restore Roman prestige, ordered his army to cross the river and engage the Carthaginian forces. The Roman soldiers, roused from their beds before dawn and forced to march through the icy water, arrived at the battlefield in a state of physical and psychological stress that undermined their fighting effectiveness. The contrast with Hannibal's troops, who had been fed and warmed before the battle, was stark and would prove decisive. The battle itself unfolded according to a tactical pattern that Hannibal would refine and perfect over the course of his Italian campaigns. The Carthaginian center, composed primarily of Gallic troops, engaged the Roman legions in frontal combat while giving ground in a controlled retreat. This apparent weakness drew the Roman forces forward, stretching their lines and creating opportunities for the more experienced African troops positioned on the flanks to execute enveloping movements. The climax of the battle came when Hannibal's brother Mago, who had been concealed with 2,000 elite troops in a ravine near the battlefield, emerged to strike the Roman rear. This coordinated attack from multiple directions created panic in the Roman ranks and transformed what had appeared to be a Roman victory into a devastating defeat. The psychological impact of the surprise attack, combined with the physical exhaustion of fighting in winter conditions, led to the collapse of Roman morale and organization. The Roman losses at Trebia were catastrophic, with estimates suggesting that as many as 30,000 Roman and allied troops were killed or captured. The survivors, scattered and demoralized, retreated toward the Alps, leaving Hannibal in control of most of northern Italy. The victory provided Hannibal with additional recruits from Gallic tribes and established his reputation as a commander who could defeat Roman armies through superior tactics and strategic thinking. The spring of 217 BCE brought new challenges as Hannibal prepared to advance deeper into Italy. The Roman Senate, shocked by the defeats at Ticinus and Trebia, had appointed Gaius Flaminius as consul and given him a large army with orders to prevent Hannibal from advancing toward Rome. Flaminius was an experienced politician and military commander, but his appointment reflected the Roman tendency to view military challenges as problems that could be solved through conventional means. Hannibal's advance through the marshes of the Arno River demonstrated his willingness to accept enormous risks in pursuit of strategic objectives. The army's passage through the flooded lowlands of central Italy during the spring floods required 4 days of continuous marching through water that sometimes reached chest height. The physical demands of this march, combined with the diseases that flourished in the marshy environment, took a terrible toll on the troops and resulted in the loss of most of the remaining elephants. The personal cost of the marsh crossing was symbolized by Hannibal's loss of sight in one eye, apparently due to an infection contracted during the march. This injury, which would mark him for the rest of his life, demonstrated the personal risks that he was willing to accept in pursuit of his strategic objectives. The sight of their commander sharing the hardships of the march, even at the cost of permanent physical damage, strengthened the loyalty of his troops and reinforced their belief in his leadership. The ambush at Lake Trasimene in June 217 BCE represented, perhaps, the most tactically brilliant victory of Hannibal's career. The battle site, chosen after careful reconnaissance of the terrain, provided ideal conditions for the kind of surprise attack that had become a hallmark of Carthaginian strategy. The narrow passage between the lake and the surrounding hills created a natural trap that would channel the Roman army into a killing ground where superior numbers would provide no advantage. The morning of the battle dawned foggy and overcast, with a thick mist rising from the lake that reduced visibility to a few dozen yards. Hannibal had positioned his troops during the night, with African and Spanish veterans occupying the high ground overlooking the road while Gallic warriors were concealed in the hills on the opposite side. The Roman army, marching in column formation and expecting to encounter the Carthaginians in open battle, walked directly into the carefully prepared ambush. The engagement began with a devastating attack on the Roman vanguard by the African troops positioned on the hills above the road. The surprise assault, delivered from above by invisible attackers, created immediate panic in the Roman ranks. The narrow confines of the passage prevented the Romans from deploying in their traditional battle formations, while the fog made it impossible for commanders to assess the situation or coordinate defensive measures. Flaminius himself was killed early in the battle, apparently in single combat with a Gallic warrior who had sworn to avenge his tribe's defeat in a previous Roman campaign. The death of the consul created a command crisis that paralyzed Roman response to the unfolding disaster. Without clear leadership and unable to see their enemies in the fog, the Roman soldiers fought desperately but without coordination, making them easy targets for the Carthaginian forces attacking from all sides. The battle lasted approximately 3 hours, but the outcome was decided within the first few minutes when the coordinated attacks from the hills above created chaos in the Roman column. The narrow passage prevented escape, while the lake blocked any retreat in that direction. The result was a massacre that eliminated an entire Roman army and demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Hannibal's tactical innovations. The casualties at Lake Trasimene were staggering even by the standards of ancient warfare. Of the approximately 25,000 Roman and allied troops who had entered the ambush, nearly 15,000 were killed and most of the remainder were captured. The victory provided Hannibal with vast quantities of arms and equipment, as well as prisoners who could be used for prisoner exchanges or, in the case of Roman allies, potentially recruited to the Carthaginian cause. The psychological impact of the disaster at Lake Trasimene was felt throughout Italy and beyond. The news of another devastating defeat, following so soon after the losses at Ticinus and Trebia, created panic in Rome and raised questions about the Republic's ability to defend itself against the Carthaginian threat. The traditional Roman confidence in their military superiority was shaken, and many began to question whether conventional tactics could succeed against Hannibal's innovations. The Roman response to the crisis involved the appointment of Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, a constitutional office that granted him extraordinary powers to deal with the emergency. Fabius, who would earn the nickname Cunctator or the Delayer, developed a strategic approach that avoided direct confrontation with Hannibal while attempting to limit his freedom of movement and prevent him from achieving decisive strategic objectives. The Fabian strategy, as it came to be known, involved shadowing Hannibal's army while avoiding battle, attacking his supply lines and foraging parties, and gradually wearing down his forces through attrition. This approach reflected a sophisticated understanding of the strategic situation. Rome's advantages lay in its vast manpower reserves and its network of fortified cities, while Hannibal's strength was concentrated in his ability to win battles through superior tactics and leadership. The implementation of the Fabian strategy required enormous political courage, as it involved accepting the temporary occupation of Roman territory and the destruction of Roman property in exchange for long-term strategic advantage. The sight of Carthaginian forces ravaging the Italian countryside while Roman armies avoided battle created intense political pressure on Fabius and his supporters. Many Romans viewed the strategy as cowardly and demanded immediate action to drive out the invaders. Hannibal's response to the Fabian strategy demonstrated his understanding of the political dimensions of warfare. Unable to bring the Romans to battle, he focused on ravaging the territories of Rome's allies in an attempt to break up the confederation that provided the Republic with its military strength. The systematic destruction of crops, livestock, and infrastructure was designed to demonstrate that Rome could not protect its allies and to encourage defections to the Carthaginian cause. The march through Campania in the summer of 217 BCE illustrated the complex interplay between military operations and political objectives that characterized this phase of the war. Hannibal's army moved through some of the richest agricultural land in Italy, destroying crops and capturing livestock while carefully avoiding damage to the properties of potential allies. The discrimination shown in these raids demonstrated the political sophistication of Hannibal's strategy and his understanding of the fragile nature of Roman political control. The autumn of 217 BCE brought new challenges as Hannibal prepared for another winter campaign. The Roman strategy of avoiding battle while attacking his supply lines had created logistical difficulties that required constant attention and creative solutions. The need to keep his diverse army fed and equipped while operating in hostile territory tested his organizational abilities and the loyalty of his troops. The winter quarters established in Apulia provided temporary respite from the constant maneuvering that had characterized the campaign season. The region's agricultural wealth and its distance from major Roman strongholds made it an ideal location for rest and resupply. The time was used to integrate new recruits, repair equipment, and prepare for the campaigns that would follow in the spring. The Roman elections for 216 BCE brought to power two consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who represented different approaches to the Carthaginian challenge. Varro, a populist politician who had risen from humble origins, advocated for aggressive action against Hannibal and criticized the Fabian strategy as ineffective. Paulus, a member of the Roman nobility with extensive military experience, was more cautious but recognized the political impossibility of continuing to avoid battle indefinitely. The preparation of the largest army in Roman history for the campaign of 216 BCE reflected the Republic's determination to end the Carthaginian threat through decisive military action. 8 legions, supported by an equal number of allied troops, were assembled under the joint command of the two consuls. The force of approximately 87,000 men represented the largest concentration of Roman military power ever assembled, and its deployment reflected the Senate's confidence that superior numbers would overcome Carthaginian tactical advantages. The stage was set for the confrontation that would determine the fate of both civilizations. Hannibal, with his veteran army of perhaps 50,000 men, prepared to face the largest Roman army ever assembled. The tactical genius that had enabled him to defeat Roman forces at Ticinus, Trebia, and Lake Trasimene would now face its ultimate test against an enemy that had learned from previous defeats and was determined to use its numerical superiority to achieve victory. The warm summer of 216 BCE brought both armies to the plains of Apulia, where the ancient town of Cannae would give its name to the most famous battle in ancient history. The convergence of these massive forces in the fertile countryside of southeastern Italy created a sense of anticipation that could be felt throughout the ancient world. The outcome of their confrontation would determine not just the fate of the Second Punic War, but the future direction of Mediterranean civilization. Chapter 4. Preparation for battle. The ancient town of Cannae, situated on a low hill overlooking the Aufidus River in the heart of Apulia, had witnessed the passage of armies before, but never had it seen forces of such magnitude converging on its fertile plains. The settlement itself was modest, consisting of stone houses clustered around a small acropolis, but its strategic location at the confluence of several important roads made it a natural gathering point for military operations in southeastern Italy. The summer heat of 216 BCE shimmered over the golden wheat fields that surrounded the town, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere as two of the ancient world's greatest military forces prepared for their fateful encounter. Hannibal's army had arrived in the region in late June, following a careful march through the mountainous terrain of central Italy. The Carthaginian commander's decision to advance into Apulia reflected his deep understanding of both military strategy and Roman psychology. The rich agricultural lands of the region provided excellent foraging opportunities for his troops, while the open terrain offered the possibility of the kind of pitched battle that would allow him to demonstrate his tactical superiority over Roman military doctrine. The psychological dimension of Hannibal's choice of battleground was equally important. By positioning his army near Cannae, he was threatening one of Rome's most important supply depots and forcing the Romans to respond to his initiative rather than pursuing their own strategic objectives. The town served as a collection point for grain destined for Roman armies operating throughout southern Italy, and its capture would severely disrupt Roman logistics while providing Hannibal's forces with abundant supplies. The Carthaginian army that established its camp near Cannae in early July represented the culmination of nearly 2 years of warfare on Italian soil. The force of approximately 50,000 men had been forged through shared hardship and constant campaigning into one of the most effective military organizations in ancient history. The diversity that had characterized the army from its origins in Spain remained evident, but the long campaign had created bonds of loyalty and mutual dependence that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries. The African infantry, forming the backbone of Hannibal's army, had been equipped with arms and armor captured from defeated Roman forces. These veterans, numbering approximately 12,000 men, wore Roman mail shirts and carried Roman shields, creating a visual symbol of their victories while providing them with equipment superior to their original armament. Their discipline and tactical flexibility had been proven in 3 major battles: and their confidence in their commander's tactical genius was absolute. The Spanish infantry, roughly 8,000 strong, brought to the army a fierce warrior culture and an intimate knowledge of individual combat that complemented the more formal tactical approach of their African comrades. Their distinctive weapons, including the curved falcata swords that had proven so effective in previous engagements, added tactical diversity to the army's capabilities. The Spanish troops' experience in irregular warfare and their ability to adapt to changing battlefield conditions made them invaluable in the fluid tactical situations that Hannibal preferred. The Gallic contingent, swollen by recruits from tribes throughout northern and central Italy, now numbered nearly 20,000 warriors. These men represented the most recent additions to the army, but their enthusiasm for battle and their hatred of Roman rule provided a psychological intensity that compensated for their relative lack of experience fighting in Hannibal's tactical system. The Gallic warriors' traditional fighting methods, emphasizing individual courage and ferocious charges, created a stark contrast to the disciplined formations of the Roman legions. The cavalry component of Hannibal's army, though reduced by the losses of the Alpine crossing and subsequent campaigns, remained formidable. The Numidian light cavalry, perhaps 3,000 strong, continued to provide the mobility and harassment capabilities that had proven so effective in previous battles. Their ability to strike quickly and disappear before the enemy could respond had become legendary, and their presence on the battlefield created a psychological impact that extended far beyond their actual numbers. The Spanish and Gallic heavy cavalry, numbering approximately 4,000 men, provided the shock power necessary for decisive attacks against formed enemy units. These horsemen, equipped with long spears and heavy armor, represented the elite of their respective peoples and had developed a fierce loyalty to Hannibal personally. Their effectiveness in previous battles had established them as one of the most feared military units in the ancient world. The Roman response to Hannibal's positioning near Cannae reflected the political pressures that had been building in Rome since the disasters at Trebia and Lake Trasimene. The Senate's decision to assemble the largest army in Roman history demonstrated their determination to end the Carthaginian threat through decisive military action. The force of 8 legions, supported by an equal number of allied troops, represented not just a military response but a statement of Roman resolve that would be felt throughout the Mediterranean world. The 2 consuls elected for 216 BCE, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, brought different perspectives and experiences to the command of this massive force. Varro, representing the popular party in Roman politics, had built his career on appeals to the common people and criticism of the aristocratic establishment. His advocacy for aggressive action against Hannibal reflected both his political instincts and his genuine belief that Roman courage and numerical superiority would overcome Carthaginian tactical innovations. Paulus, by contrast, represented the conservative wing of Roman politics and possessed extensive military experience that had taught him to respect the challenges of warfare. His previous campaigns had included successful operations against Illyrian pirates and experience in the complex diplomatic and military situations that characterized Roman expansion. His appointment as consul reflected the Senate's recognition that the Carthaginian threat required experienced leadership. The Roman army that marched south toward Cannae in July 216 BCE was organized according to principles that had been refined through centuries of Italian warfare. The 8 legions, each containing approximately 5,000 men, were supported by an equal number of allied troops drawn from the cities and peoples of the Roman Confederation. This system of dual citizenship and military obligation had proven remarkably effective in previous conflicts, providing Rome with a vast reservoir of trained manpower. The Roman legionary of 216 BCE was a citizen soldier who owned sufficient property to qualify for military service. These men, primarily farmers and artisans, served without pay but were entitled to a share of any spoils captured during campaigns. Their training emphasized discipline, endurance, and the ability to fight effectively as part of a unit. The Roman military system created soldiers who were individually competent but who derived their greatest strength from collective action. The organization of Roman legions around the manipular system provided tactical flexibility that had proven effective against the various enemies Rome had encountered during its expansion throughout Italy. The manipulation, small units of 120 men arranged in 3 lines, could advance or retreat independently while maintaining overall formation integrity. This system allowed Roman commanders to adapt their tactics to different opponents and battlefield conditions. The Roman military equipment of the period reflected the practical experience gained through generations of warfare. The gladius, a short thrusting sword designed for close combat, was complemented by the pilum, a heavy javelin designed to penetrate enemy shields and armor. The large rectangular shield, or scutum, provided protection while allowing for coordinated defensive formations. The mail shirt, or larica hamata, offered protection against both cutting and thrusting weapons. The Roman allied forces that accompanied the legions to Cannae represented the diversity of the Italian peninsula and the success of Rome's confederate system. Latin allies, who shared cultural and linguistic ties with Rome, provided troops equipped and trained according to Roman standards. Other Italian peoples, including Samnites, Umbrians, and Etruscans, contributed specialized units that reflected their own military traditions while integrating into the broader Roman tactical system. The march of the Roman army toward Cannae in July 216 BCE was a logistical achievement that demonstrated the organizational capabilities that had made Roman expansion possible. The movement of nearly 87,000 men, along with their equipment, supplies, and support personnel, required careful coordination and extensive planning. The army's baggage trains stretched for miles, carrying everything necessary to sustain the force during what the Romans expected would be a decisive campaign. The Roman approach to the coming battle reflected confidence born of previous military success and a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the enemy they faced. The Roman military tradition emphasized the importance of discipline, training, and superior numbers in achieving victory. The concept that a smaller force might defeat a larger one through superior tactics was foreign to Roman military thinking, which viewed warfare as essentially a test of strength and endurance. The psychological preparation of the Roman army for battle reflected both the confidence of their commanders and the anxiety created by Hannibal's previous victories. The soldiers had been told that their superior numbers and equipment would overcome any tactical advantages the Carthaginians might possess. The presence of two consuls, representing the highest authority of the Roman state, was intended to inspire confidence and demonstrate the Republic's commitment to victory. The Roman camp established near Cannae in late July represented a masterpiece of military engineering that reflected generations of experience in campaign organization. The rectangular fortification, surrounded by a ditch and palisade, provided secure accommodation for the massive army while maintaining the organizational structure necessary for effective command and control. The camp's layout, with designated areas for different units and specific locations for command facilities, demonstrated the systematic approach that characterized Roman military operations. The intelligence gathering that preceded the battle revealed the different approaches that the two commanders took to military planning. Hannibal relied on a network of spies and informants that included both Gallic allies and Roman deserters, providing him with detailed information about Roman intentions and capabilities. His understanding of Roman military doctrine, gained through careful study of previous encounters, enabled him to anticipate Roman tactical decisions and prepare appropriate responses. The Roman intelligence efforts, by contrast, focused primarily on determining the size and composition of Hannibal's army rather than understanding his tactical intentions. The Roman military tradition emphasized the importance of knowing the enemy's strength while assuming that superior numbers would overcome any tactical disadvantages. This approach reflected the Roman experience of warfare against enemies who fought according to predictable patterns and could be defeated through superior organization and equipment. The final days before the battle were marked by increasing tension as both armies completed their preparations. Hannibal's forces, positioned on the south bank of the Aufidus River, could observe the Roman army's movements while maintaining the tactical flexibility that had characterized their previous operations. The Carthaginian camp, smaller and more mobile than its Roman counterpart, reflected the different organizational principles that guided the two armies. The Roman army's final preparations reflected the confidence of commanders who believed that their superior numbers and equipment would ensure victory. The soldiers were informed that they would face an enemy weakened by 2 years of campaigning and diminished by the losses of the Alpine crossing. The prospect of finally bringing Hannibal to battle in terrain that favored Roman tactical methods created an atmosphere of optimism that pervaded the entire army. The weather during the days preceding the battle was hot and dry, typical of the Apulian summer. The lack of rain had reduced the Aufidus River to a manageable level, while the hard ground provided excellent conditions for the movement of large military formations. The clear skies and good visibility would allow commanders on both sides to observe the battlefield and coordinate their forces effectively. The religious observances that preceded the battle reflected the different spiritual traditions that guided the two armies. The Romans conducted the traditional sacrifices and consulted the auguries to determine whether the gods favored their cause. The favorable omens reported by the priests reinforced the confidence of the Roman commanders and provided additional justification for their aggressive approach to the coming engagement. Hannibal's army, drawn from diverse religious traditions, conducted its own spiritual preparations according to the customs of different peoples. The Carthaginian commander, himself a devotee of the goddess Tanit, ensured that all ethnic groups within his army had the opportunity to invoke their deities and perform the rituals that would prepare them for battle. This attention to the spiritual needs of his diverse forces demonstrated the cultural sensitivity that had enabled him to maintain unity among troops from different backgrounds. The night before the battle, both commanders addressed their troops in speeches that reflected their different approaches to military leadership. Hannibal, speaking to his assembled officers in multiple languages, emphasized the tactical advantages his army possessed and the opportunities for glory and wealth that victory would bring. His calm confidence and detailed explanation of his battle plan reinforced the loyalty of subordinates who had followed him through countless challenges. The Roman commanders, addressing their troops in the formal style of Roman military oratory, emphasized the importance of discipline, courage, and loyalty to the Republic. Their speeches, filled with references to Roman military traditions and the glory of previous victories, were designed to inspire confidence and reinforce the psychological preparation that had been ongoing throughout the campaign. The final tactical preparations revealed the different approaches that the two commanders would take to the battle. Hannibal's plan, conceived through careful analysis of Roman military doctrine and the specific conditions of the battlefield, represented a masterpiece of tactical innovation that would revolutionize military thinking. His positioning of troops reflected an understanding of psychological warfare and the importance of timing in achieving decisive results. The Roman battle plan, based on traditional tactical principles and confidence in numerical superiority, called for a straightforward assault that would use the army's superior numbers to overwhelm the Carthaginian forces. The Romans intended to deploy their legions in the standard formation that had proven effective in previous battles, with the expectation that superior discipline and equipment would ensure victory. As the sun set on August 1st, 216 BCE, both armies completed their final preparations for the battle that would determine the fate of the war. The soldiers on both sides understood that the coming engagement would be decisive, but few could have imagined the tactical masterpiece that was about to unfold. The stage was set for one of the most studied battles in military history, a confrontation that would demonstrate the triumph of tactical genius over numerical superiority and change the course of Western civilization. The warm summer night settled over the plains of Cannae as thousands of soldiers from across the ancient world prepared for sleep, knowing that the dawn would bring a battle that would be remembered for millennia. The gentle breeze from the Aufidus River carried with it the sounds of two great armies making their final preparations, while the stars above looked down on a scene that would soon become legend. Chapter 5: The Battle. The dawn of August 2nd, 216 BCE, broke clear and bright over the plains of Cannae, with the first rays of sunlight painting the wheat fields in shades of gold and amber. The morning air was still cool from the night, carrying with it the scent of wild herbs and the distant sound of the Aufidus River flowing gently toward the sea. In the camps of both armies, the sounds of preparation began before the sun had fully risen, the clatter of weapons being readied, the low murmur of prayers in a dozen different languages, and the methodical sounds of men preparing for what many knew would be their last day on earth. Hannibal rose before dawn, as was his custom, and walked quietly through his camp to observe the preparations of his diverse army. The Carthaginian commander, now 32 years old and marked by the hardships of his Italian campaigns, moved with the careful grace of a man who had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated his army's readiness for battle. His weathered features, scarred by his passage through the Alps and darkened by 2 years of campaigning under the Italian sun, reflected the quiet confidence of a commander who had never lost a battle. The deployment of Hannibal's army began in the pre-dawn darkness, with each contingent moving to positions that had been carefully planned and rehearsed. The Carthaginian battle line, as it took shape in the growing light, represented a masterpiece of tactical innovation that would revolutionize military thinking for centuries to come. The formation appeared conventional to Roman observers, but it concealed a sophisticated plan that would transform apparent weakness into decisive strength. The center of Hannibal's line was held by approximately 20,000 Gallic and Spanish infantry, arranged in a formation that bulged forward toward the enemy like a bow drawn taut. These warriors, their shields bright with tribal designs and their weapons gleaming in the morning sun, represented the most volatile element of Hannibal's army. Their positioning in the center was not accidental but reflected Hannibal's profound understanding of both tactics and psychology. The Gallic warriors, their long hair braided for battle and their bodies painted with the blue woad that had terrified enemies for generations, carried themselves with the fierce pride of men who had sworn to die rather than retreat. Their long swords, capable of cleaving through armor and bone, reflected the morning light as they moved into position. The psychological impact of their appearance, combined with their reputation for ferocity in battle, was intended to create fear in the Roman ranks even before the fighting began. The Spanish infantry, positioned alongside their Gallic allies, brought a different but equally formidable martial tradition to the battle line. These veterans of the Iberian campaigns wore leather armor reinforced with metal plates and carried the distinctive round shields that had protected their ancestors for centuries. Their primary weapon, the falcata, was a curved sword that had proven devastatingly effective against Roman equipment in previous encounters. On the flanks of this forward-projecting center, Hannibal placed his most reliable troops, the African infantry that had formed the backbone of his army throughout the Italian campaign. These 12,000 veterans, equipped with Roman arms and armor captured in previous battles, were positioned where they could observe the development of the battle and respond to Hannibal's signals. Their discipline and tactical flexibility, proven in 3 major engagements, made them the perfect instrument for the decisive phase of the battle plan. The cavalry deployment reflected Hannibal's understanding of the crucial role that mounted troops would play in the coming engagement. On the left flank, near the Aufidus River, he positioned his Spanish and Gallic heavy cavalry under the command of Hasdrubal, his most trusted lieutenant. These 4,000 horsemen, equipped with long spears and heavy armor, represented the striking power that would be needed to break through the Roman cavalry screen and attack the enemy's flanks. The right flank was held by the Numidian light cavalry, whose mobility and harassment tactics had proven so effective in previous battles. These 3,000 warriors, riding their swift horses without saddles and armed with javelins and light spears, would provide the flexibility needed to exploit opportunities as they developed during the battle. Their commander, Maharbal, was renowned throughout the army for his tactical skill and his ability to inspire his men to extraordinary feats of courage. The Roman deployment, by contrast, reflected the confidence and conventional thinking that had characterized their approach to the Carthaginian threat. The consuls Varro and Paulus, alternating command according to Roman custom, had decided to deploy their vast army in a formation that would use superior numbers to overwhelm the Carthaginian forces through sheer weight of attack. The Roman battle line, as it took shape in the morning light, represented the largest concentration of military power that the ancient world had ever seen. The Roman center consisted of 4 legions deployed in the traditional manipular formation, with the hastati forming the front line, the principes providing support, and the triarii serving as a final reserve. These 20,000 men, equipped with standardized weapons and trained in coordinated tactics, represented the finest infantry force that Rome had ever assembled. Their confidence in their superiority was evident in their steady advance and the disciplined precision of their movements. The Allied troops, positioned on either side of the Roman legions, brought the total infantry strength to nearly 70,000 men. These soldiers, drawn from cities and peoples throughout the Italian peninsula, had been trained according to Roman standards and equipped with weapons that complemented the Roman tactical system. Their loyalty to Rome had been tested in previous conflicts, and their presence at Cannae demonstrated the strength of the Roman Confederate system. The Roman cavalry, numbering approximately 6,000 men, was positioned on the flanks of the infantry formation according to traditional tactical doctrine. The Roman horse, though individually brave and well-equipped, lacked the specialized training and cultural traditions that made the Carthaginian cavalry so effective. Their role in the coming battle would be to protect the flanks of the infantry and, if possible, to break through the Carthaginian cavalry screen to attack the enemy's rear. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the temperature began to rise, and the hot, dry air of the Apulian summer created shimmering heat waves that danced above the wheat fields. The wind, blowing from the southeast, carried dust and sand that would favor the Carthaginian forces, who had positioned themselves with their backs to the breeze. This seemingly minor environmental factor would prove significant as the battle developed, creating additional discomfort for the Roman forces while providing a psychological advantage to their enemies. The preliminary skirmishing began around mid-morning, with light troops from both armies engaging in the traditional combat that preceded major battles in the ancient world. The Balearic slingers serving with Hannibal's army, renowned throughout the Mediterranean for their deadly accuracy, began targeting Roman officers and standard-bearers with their lead bullets. The psychological impact of these attacks, combined with the casualties they inflicted, created the first signs of tension in the Roman ranks. The Roman velites, light infantry armed with javelins and small shields, responded with their own harassment tactics, but they found themselves outmatched by the diverse array of missile troops that Hannibal had assembled. Numidian javelin throwers, Spanish cetrati, and Gallic slingers created a continuous rain of projectiles that forced the Roman skirmishers to retreat behind the protection of their main battle line. The first major phase of the battle began with the advance of the Roman center, as thousands of legionaries moved forward in the disciplined formation that had conquered Italy. The sight of this massive force advancing across the plain, their armor glinting in the sun and their standards flying above the ranks, created a spectacle that awed even their enemies. The rhythmic sound of their marching feet, combined with the clatter of their equipment, created a psychological impact that had broken the resolve of countless enemies. Hannibal's response to the Roman advance demonstrated the tactical genius that had made him one of history's greatest military commanders. Rather than meeting the Roman attack with a static defense, he ordered his Gallic and Spanish center to advance to meet the enemy, creating the impression of an aggressive assault that would appeal to the natural fighting instincts of his tribal warriors. This forward movement, carefully controlled and coordinated, drew the Roman forces into the killing ground that Hannibal had prepared. The collision between the two centers created a sound that could be heard for miles. The crash of shield against shield, the ring of metal on metal, and the cries of thousands of men locked in mortal combat. The Roman legionaries, fighting with the disciplined precision that had made them masters of the Mediterranean, pressed forward against the Carthaginian line with the confidence of men who had never known defeat in pitched battle. The Gallic and Spanish warriors, fighting with the individual courage and ferocity that characterized their martial traditions, met the Roman assault with a determination that matched their enemies' discipline. The clash of these different fighting styles created a dynamic that would characterize the entire battle: the measured advance of Roman discipline against the passionate resistance of tribal warriors fighting for their lives and their honor. As the battle in the center developed, Hannibal's tactical plan began to unfold with the precision of a carefully orchestrated performance. The Gallic and Spanish troops, following their commander's instructions, began to give ground in the face of the Roman advance. This withdrawal, which appeared to Roman observers as evidence of their superiority, was actually a carefully controlled maneuver designed to draw the Roman forces deeper into the Carthaginian position. The psychological impact of this apparent success created exactly the effect that Hannibal had intended. The Roman commanders, seeing their center making progress against the enemy, ordered additional troops forward to exploit what appeared to be a breakthrough. The Roman formation, originally deployed in careful lines with proper spacing between units, began to compress as more men pushed forward to participate in what seemed to be a decisive victory. The flanking actions that would determine the outcome of the battle began simultaneously with the fighting in the center. On the Roman right flank, near the Aufidus River, Hasdrubal's Spanish and Gallic heavy cavalry engaged the Roman horse in a fierce melee that demonstrated the superior training and equipment of the Carthaginian forces. The Roman cavalry, though brave and determined, found themselves outmatched by enemies who had been trained from childhood in the arts of mounted warfare. The terrain near the river favored the Carthaginian cavalry, whose horses were better trained for fighting in confined spaces and whose riders possessed the individual skills necessary for effective close combat. The Roman horsemen, accustomed to fighting in open formations and relying on mass charges rather than individual prowess, found themselves at a severe disadvantage in the hand-to-hand fighting that characterized cavalry combat. The defeat of the Roman cavalry on the right flank was swift and decisive, with Hasdrubal's forces breaking through the Roman line and routing the enemy horsemen within the first hour of the battle. This victory freed the Carthaginian heavy cavalry to pursue the fleeing Romans and then to regroup for the next phase of the battle plan. The psychological impact of seeing their cavalry in flight created the first serious doubts among the Roman infantry about the outcome of the engagement. On the opposite flank, the engagement between the Numidian light cavalry and the Roman allied horse followed a different pattern but achieved similar results. The Numidians, using their traditional tactics of harassment and withdrawal, drew the Roman cavalry away from the main battle line in a series of feints and mock retreats. This maneuver, perfectly executed according to plans that had been rehearsed for months, gradually separated the Roman horse from their supporting infantry. The Roman allied cavalry, following what appeared to be a routing enemy, found themselves drawn into a series of individual combats where their superior numbers provided no advantage. The Numidians, fighting in their traditional manner with javelins and swift charges, gradually wore down the Roman forces through a combination of superior mobility and tactical flexibility. The Roman horsemen, unable to bring their enemies to decisive battle, found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable. As the cavalry actions developed on both flanks, the battle in the center reached its crucial phase. The Roman legionaries, encouraged by their apparent success against the Carthaginian center, pressed forward with increasing intensity. The Gallic and Spanish troops, following Hannibal's plan, continued their controlled withdrawal while maintaining the integrity of their formation. This gradual retreat, invisible to Roman observers focused on their immediate fronts, was drawing the Roman army deeper into the tactical trap that Hannibal had prepared. The compression of the Roman formation, as more troops pushed forward to exploit the apparent breakthrough, created exactly the conditions that Hannibal's plan required. The Roman legions, originally deployed in lines with proper spacing for individual combat, found themselves pressed together in a dense mass that negated many of their tactical advantages. The soldiers in the rear ranks, unable to see the overall development of the battle, pressed forward in their eagerness to participate in what appeared to be a decisive victory. The moment of tactical decision came when Hannibal judged that the Roman center had advanced far enough into his position to be vulnerable to the flanking attacks that would complete his tactical masterpiece. The signal for the final phase of the battle was given by horn calls that echoed across the battlefield, indicating to the African troops on the flanks that the time had come to execute the maneuver that would decide the fate of both armies. The African infantry, positioned on the flanks of the Roman advance, began their coordinated attack with the precision of a military drill. These veteran troops, equipped with Roman weapons and trained in Roman tactics, understood exactly what was required of them. Their advance, conducted in perfect silence and with deadly efficiency, caught the Roman forces completely by surprise. The Roman legionaries, focused on their battle with the Gallic and Spanish troops to their front, were unprepared for the coordinated assault that struck them from both sides simultaneously. The psychological impact of this surprise attack, combined with the tactical confusion it created, began the process that would transform Roman confidence into panic and eventual disaster. The development of the double envelopment, as military historians would later term Hannibal's tactical innovation, required perfect timing and coordination among all elements of the Carthaginian army. The African troops, advancing from both flanks, began to close the gap behind the Roman forces that had advanced too far into the Carthaginian position. The formation that emerged from this maneuver would create a tactical situation that no Roman army had ever faced. The Roman response to the flanking attacks demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of their military system. The individual courage and discipline of the legionaries enabled them to continue fighting even in the face of attack from multiple directions. However, the rigid command structure and standardized tactics that had served Rome so well in previous conflicts proved inadequate for dealing with the complex tactical situation that Hannibal had created. The attempted Roman counterattacks against the African flanking forces revealed the tactical limitations of the manipular system when faced with an enemy that refused to fight according to conventional patterns. The Roman units, trained to advance in coordinated lines and to rely on superior numbers for victory, found themselves unable to deploy effectively against enemies who attacked from unexpected directions and used terrain and timing to negate numerical advantages. As the battle entered its final phase, the Carthaginian cavalry began to play the decisive role that Hannibal had envisioned. Hasdrubal, having defeated the Roman cavalry on the right flank, regrouped his forces and began a sweeping movement that would bring his horsemen into the Roman rear. This maneuver, requiring both tactical skill and perfect timing, would complete the encirclement of the Roman army and seal their fate. The arrival of the Carthaginian cavalry in the Roman rear created the final element of the tactical masterpiece that Hannibal had conceived. The Roman army, already engaged on three sides by the African infantry and the reformed Gallic and Spanish center, now found themselves completely surrounded by enemies. The psychological impact of this realization spread through the Roman ranks like wildfire, creating the panic that would transform tactical defeat into complete disaster. The battle's climax came as the Roman army, compressed into an ever-decreasing space and attacked from all sides, began to lose the cohesion that had made them masters of the Mediterranean world. The individual courage of the Roman soldiers continued to manifest itself in desperate local combats, but the overall tactical situation had become hopeless. The Roman formation, designed for advance and attack, proved incapable of defending against coordinated assault from multiple directions. The death of Lucius Aemilius Paulus, one of the two consuls commanding the Roman army, symbolized the collapse of Roman hopes for victory. The consul, wounded in the early stages of the battle and unable to escape the closing trap, died fighting with a small group of his personal guard. His death, witnessed by thousands of Roman soldiers, created a psychological shock that accelerated the disintegration of Roman resistance. The final phase of the battle became a massacre rather than a tactical engagement. As the surrounded Roman forces found themselves unable to retreat or maneuver, the Carthaginian forces, fighting with the coordination and purpose that had characterized their entire campaign, systematically eliminated pockets of Roman resistance. The superior mobility and tactical flexibility of Hannibal's army enabled them to maintain pressure on all sides of the shrinking Roman formation. The few Roman units that managed to break through the Carthaginian encirclement found themselves pursued by the Numidian cavalry, whose speed and endurance made escape virtually impossible. The flat terrain of the Cannae Plain, which had initially favored the deployment of the massive Roman army, now worked against the survivors as they fled across open ground with no hope of concealment or defensive positions. The sound of battle, which had begun with the clash of organized formations and the shouts of coordinated advances, gradually gave way to the desperate cries of individual combat and the moans of the wounded and dying. The heat of the summer afternoon, combined with the physical exertion of prolonged fighting, created additional suffering for the combatants on both sides. The dust raised by the movement of so many men and horses created a choking cloud that reduced visibility and added to the confusion of the final phases of the battle. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, the Battle of Cannae drew to its inevitable conclusion. The Roman army, which had begun the day as the largest military force in the ancient world, had been virtually destroyed through a combination of tactical brilliance and flawless execution. The few survivors who managed to escape the battlefield carried with them the news of one of the most complete military disasters in recorded history. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true magnitude of Hannibal's tactical achievement. The casualties suffered by the Roman forces were staggering even by the standards of ancient warfare. Approximately 50,000 Roman and allied soldiers had been killed, with thousands more captured. The Carthaginian losses, by contrast, were relatively light, with perhaps 6,000 men killed or wounded. The disparity in casualties demonstrated the effectiveness of Hannibal's tactical innovations and the psychological impact of his double envelopment. The collection of spoils from the battlefield provided Hannibal's army with vast quantities of equipment and supplies, including thousands of sets of Roman armor and weapons. The psychological impact of these captured materials, combined with the practical benefits they provided, reinforced the morale of the Carthaginian forces and provided tangible evidence of their victory. The sight of Roman equipment in Carthaginian hands would become a powerful symbol of the transformation of the strategic situation. The treatment of prisoners reflected the political dimension of Hannibal's strategy and his understanding of the importance of winning Italian allies to his cause. Roman citizens who had been captured were held for ransom or prisoner exchange, while allied troops were given the opportunity to join the Carthaginian army or return to their homes. This discriminatory treatment was designed to encourage defections from the Roman Confederation and to demonstrate that Hannibal's war was against Rome rather than against the peoples of Italy. As darkness fell over the battlefield of Cannae, the magnitude of what had occurred began to become clear to participants and observers alike. The tactical masterpiece that Hannibal had conceived and executed with such precision had not only destroyed the largest Roman army ever assembled, but had also demonstrated the possibility of defeating numerically superior forces through superior tactics and leadership. The battle would be studied and analyzed by military commanders for over 2 millennia, becoming the model for tactical excellence and strategic thinking. The night after the battle was filled with the sounds of celebration from the Carthaginian camp and the moans of the wounded and dying scattered across the plain. The contrast between victory and defeat, between triumph and disaster, created a dramatic tableau that captured the essential nature of ancient warfare. The fate of civilizations could be decided in a single day by the tactical genius of one commander and the courage of the men who followed him into battle. The gentle breeze that had blown from the southeast throughout the day now carried with it the scent of victory and defeat, of glory and disaster intermingled. The stars that looked down on the battlefield of Cannae witnessed the end of one chapter in the ancient world's history and the beginning of another. The battle was over, but its consequences would echo through the centuries, changing the course of Western civilization and establishing Hannibal's reputation as one of history's greatest